Okay, and on to the Pacific Theater. So Pacific Theater, really the best beginning for that for the United States is their relationship that already precedes the event of Pearl Harbor with the Empire of Japan. Um, on the Japanese side, you already have a lot of built-up aggression. There's a lack of raw materials, lack of markets with which to trade. Japan is an emerging industrial nation, um, and the limited amount of inhabitable land also sort of forces them internally to look and expand for new areas to develop their empire. All right. Like everyone else in the world at this point, they're also hit very hard, economically speaking, by the Great Depression. Um, so, in the same way that the United States wants to maintain a sphere of influence over the Western Hemisphere, the Japanese are looking to maintain a sphere of influence over the Pacific world. Okay, so being in as much that the United States is still expanding west as the United States always has, the Japanese are now expanding out into the Pacific. It's only natural. It's only a matter of time before there is a clash. And World War II and the Great Depression era sets the stage for that in large part. Okay, so hostilities emerge when the United States largely because the United States places embargoes on Japan. We just spoke about how their lack of raw materials forces them into a situation where they feel desperate and they need to expand. So the United States actually putting embargoes on products that they already or have issues maintaining and issues accumulating is going to just basically inspire more aggressiveness in Japan. So we march forward, right? We get to a point where the events of Pearl Harbor become just forthcoming, and people do expect something to happen. Again, it's a debate still today whether or not FDR knew about Pearl Harbor or not, or the United States should have known. Is kind of irrelevant at this point, but it's things that people like to talk about. This is an image I took of a kamikaze propeller from a kamikaze plane. That is, kamikaze means a suicide attack. So this is a pilot who would literally fly his plane into an enemy battleship or some enemy craft in order to slow down the enemy. So, and some other images from Pearl Harbor when I was there a few years ago. You're looking out onto this image here does a good job. It's in the museum of showing the battleship, the USS Arizona, and the structure here off in the distance is that same structure. That's the memorial to it. This is the USS Missouri, where the war actually ended. So if the United States is where the war began and where the war ended right there. It's important to some other images of the same event. It's important to remember, though, that it's not just Pearl Harbor, not just Pearl Harbor that's attacked. It's also the Dutch East Indies, it's the Philippines. Again, just going back to that idea, the Japanese are trying to expand and, conquer and create a sphere of influence that's Japanese in the Pacific world. So, things to keep in mind. Part of the memorial within that white structure you saw before, a clock stopped on the morning, that Sunday morning, December 7th, the day of live in infamy. And then some other more popular images of a destroyed USS Arizona, FDR asking for a declaration of war of Congress, and kind of sets the stage for a post-Pearl Harbor, now U.S. Being active in the fight in the Pacific like they are now in the European theater, as we talked about. So after Pearl Harbor, it's really about stopping the Japanese expansion, and some of the personalities involved, like General Douglas MacArthur, are going to be important and familiar names really going forward, even into the Cold War era. So it's a name you want to keep in the back of your mind. Actually, he was involved in the bonus army thrashing that happened during the Hoover administration. So he's not a new name necessarily, but certainly a name you want to be familiar with. So in stopping the Japanese, you have a couple of really important battles. The first would be the Battle of the Coral Sea. And the Japanese are trying to invade Australia at this point, and largely based on the success of aircraft carriers, American aircraft carriers, British aircraft carriers. They are successful in stopping the Japanese advance into Australia. So the Battle of Coral Sea is a big shift. Another one would be, and the Japanese attempt to continue to move east towards the United States, is the Battle of Midway. And I mean, it might be worth looking at this map first. Is that you have this what's becoming a rather large. I mean, this is Japan, right? All that's in red is where the Japanese are advancing to. So they're moving towards Australia. Battle of Coral Sea will stop them here. Midway in this direction, and the Battle of Midway will stop them here. So we're trying to literally quarantine them and keep them sort of at bay. So the name in general, we just mentioned the Battle of Coral Sea, Battle of Midway, but in general it's called island hopping, or the island hopping campaign, that the United States is either moving forward where they can and feel they'll be successful in stopping the Japanese military, that is, on certain islands. They'll literally will invade a certain island and try to work their way closer and closer towards Japan. In the European theater, as you got closer to Berlin, the fighting got more intense. The fighting will only get more intense as you get closer and closer to Tokyo in Japan, the main island, Honshu of Japan, during this thing. So it's really in this theater. So the reality is it's not all that dissimilar from the European campaign and the intensity of fighting as you get closer and closer to your ultimate bullseye, your ultimate target. But the truth is, too, if the Japanese had such a strong force, and here's a picture of Douglas MacArthur, and he always insisted famously on walking onto the beachheads and bulkheads and things like that, but like he is doing here. But what I was going to say about the island hopping is that if the American forces, the Allies, realized that a certain island might be too well set up by the Japanese, if it was too, there was such a battle-hardened stance by the Japanese, they might just isolate it. They would move around it, go to another one that they feel they could invade successfully, and they would probably just blockade it with aircraft carriers. So part of the island hopping campaign is hopping from one island to the next, but knowing sort of your weaknesses too. So sometimes that's left out. So this is actually a picture of MacArthur walking onto part of the Philippines. Okay, it's a later picture, but it's worth noting now that as we're trying to stop the Japanese advance, we're also trying to take back what's been lost to the Japanese. And in this sense, you get to some pretty grim images in the Pacific Theater. Pacific Theater really is very different than the European theater. You don't have the same sort of, first of all, the racial undertones that exist. The Americans and the Nazis don't necessarily just hate each other in the same sense that you really see a racial hate that exists, a discrimination that exists between Americans and the Japanese. I mean, the way they're portrayed in political cartoons in their respective from their respective governments is, it makes it pretty clear that the Americans view the Japanese as rat-like, monkey-like creatures, and that the Japanese view the Americans as barbaric, savage invaders. And ultimately, you have some pretty, interesting and grim images that come out of this kind of stuff. So. Bataan, though, is where we center our conversation. So the Philippines have been completely taken over by the Japanese, as this headline would suggest, right? And you have some American holdouts, like, for example, on Bataan. And what ends up happening is Americans try to hold out for a long period of time. Eventually, Edward King, the American general at the time, will surrender. And they'll be overrun and taken over by Japanese. What the Japanese do next, though, is really one of the worst atrocities during World War II. Is this route here? This is sort of an old style map, and shows some of the 60-mile journey, this Bataan Death March that we've come to call it, that the Japanese forced American and Filipino, because these are also Filipino soldiers. This relationship goes back to the Spanish-American War between Americans and Filipinos, in which, by the way, Americans were not always so nice and friendly with the Filipinos. But here you see an image of Americans being forced to march this what's called the Bataan Death March, and what basically happens is as follows, and I'll sort of abbreviate some of what's here. Americans are forced to march 60 miles after having been almost come to the point of starvation before the march even started. If they were to stop or try to drink water or try to help a friend, they would either be bayoneted, literally mean stabbed, or shot. Sometimes the Japanese would actually line up a number of American and Filipino soldiers and just shoot them on sight to prove a point that they had to keep marching. And basically, you ended up with, there were about 60,000 altogether. I think about, actually, I think it's right here. Between 7,000 and 10,000 approximately were killed just on that 60-mile journey, which is where we get the name Bataan Death March. We don't have any records of this. It could have been more, it could have been less, but the reality is it's a pretty sad event to think about in the history of World War II, where so much death and destruction happened anyway. But this is something that we're not used to seeing Americans victims of. Okay, so the Battle of Leyte Gulf happens actually a couple years ago, a couple years after. But it has to do with the same thing. So this is a battle in which the United States and the Allies are trying to take back the Philippines. So this is the attempt to remove Japanese forces from there, and it is successful. So we sort of just fast forwarded a couple years in this World War II history from the Bataan Death March to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But again, it is successful. At the same time, or maybe a few months later, I should be more accurate, bombing raids over Tokyo start with the use of long-range bombers. And the really important part of the long-range bomber element of this is that you don't need, the Japanese to a large degree thought that the United States supply lines would be stretched so far that they wouldn't be able to accomplish bombing raids like this. It's largely what's protected American cities from the same type of thing. But in this respect, with these new long-range bombers, B-29s, B-52s will come later, but B-29s, for example, they can go these long distances and then make the return trip without having to land or refuel or any of that kind of stuff. And you could, this is an actual picture from these bombing raids over Tokyo, and you can just see the immense amount of bombs that are being dropped in one point. All right, but as part of island hopping, as we get closer and closer to the main islands of Japan, figuring that there could be an invasion of the main island, Honshu of Japan, we have to sort of soften the area, is what the military, the Allied military feel is appropriate. So moving closer and closer. So we get to a couple of very famous battles. Iwo Jima, for one, where, if anybody's in JROTC, you'll probably recognize this image, very, very famous image that's been, duplicated in some degrees after 9/11 and things like that. But just shows American heroism and the patriotism that exists, and the camaraderie, of course, that exists. This is, I think, Marines, Iwo Jima, U.S. Marine Force there that is going to, literally plant the American flag. There's other images of the same thing. In fact, there's a lot of images of this, and a lot has been made about how accurate this is and was the intensity actually there, like we see that it was actually there. I don't want to spoil the heroism involved, but nonetheless, as we get closer and closer to the main islands of Japan, and now later and later into the war, as you can see, February to March 1945 is when this long series of battles, I suppose, actually, right, took place. It'll be April that FDR and Hitler will both pass away, and the reality is that we're getting closer and closer to the end. The end in the European theater, which is really already happening, but also, the Pacific theater now too. So Okinawa, getting even closer to the main island of Japan, and the fighting becomes, all the more fierce. This battle was actually known as the Typhoon of Steel. You see a huge loss of life by both American soldiers, by Japanese civilians. And this is an area you really want to, focus in on as well, that, civilians are really being hurt to a large degree here, more than anybody else, or non-combatants, as we'll refer to them later. But unconditional surrender, as we've put forth, right, with the Atlantic Charter, is still an element that's important here. The Japanese, of course, do not feel that that's at all going to happen, or unconditional surrender is not at all in their minds. Right, they feel that they have a divine monarchy, that the emperor is literally given his strength from divine force, right, God, and to destroy the monarchy would be to have unconditional surrender would be the equivalent of destroying the monarchy. This comes at a time when you have new weapons of war, okay, and new developments. We just spoke about long-range bombers, but you also have long-range